For a New Liberty, The Libertarian Manifesto by Murray and Rothbard, narrated by Jeff Riggenbach, with a new introduction by Llewellyn H. Rockwell, Jr. Copyright 2006 by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. This audiobook was produced by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. For more information or to discover more about the Ludwig von Mises Institute and Austrian economics, visit Mises.org.
Introduction. There are many varieties of libertarianism alive in the world today, but Rothbardianism remains the center of its intellectual gravity, its primary muse and conscience, its strategic and moral core, and the focal point of debate even when its name is not acknowledged. The reason is that Murray Rothbard was the creator of modern libertarianism, a political ideological system that proposes a once-and-for-all escape from the trappings of left and right and their central plans for how state power should be used. Libertarianism is the radical alternative that says state power is unworkable and immoral. Mr. Libertarian, Murray and Rothbard was called, and the state's greatest living enemy. He remains so. Yet he had many predecessors from whom he drew, the whole of the classical liberal tradition, the Austrian economists, the American anti-war tradition, and the natural rights tradition. But it was he who put all these pieces together into a unified system that seems implausible at first, but inevitable once it has been defined and defended by Rothbard. The individual pieces of the system are straightforward: self-ownership, strict property rights, free markets, anti-state in every conceivable respect. But the implications are earth-shaking. Once you are exposed to the complete picture, and For a New Liberty has been the leading means of exposure for more than a quarter of a century, you cannot forget it. It becomes the indispensable lens through which we can see events in the real world with the greatest possible clarity. This book, more than any other explains why Rothbard seems to grow in stature every year. His influence has vastly risen since his death, and why Rothbardianism has so many enemies on the left, right, and center. Quite simply, the science of liberty that he brought into clear relief is as thrilling in the hope it creates for a free world as it is unforgiving of error. Its logical and moral consistency, together with its empirical explanatory muscle, represents a threat to any intellectual vision that sets out to use the state to refashion the world according to some pre-programmed plan. And to the same extent, it impresses the reader with a hopeful vision of what might be. Rothbard set out to write this book soon after he got a call from Tom Mandel, an editor at Macmillan who had seen an op-ed by Rothbard in the New York Times that appeared in the spring of 1971. It was the only commission Rothbard ever received from a commercial publishing house. Looking at the original manuscript, which is so consistent in its typeface and almost complete after its first draft, it does seem that it was nearly an effortless joy for him to write it. It is seamless, unrelenting, and energetic. The historical context illustrates a point often overlooked. Modern libertarianism was born not in reaction to socialism or leftism, though it is certainly anti-leftist, as the term is commonly understood, and anti-socialist. Rather, libertarianism in the American historical context came into being in response to the statism of conservatism and its selected celebration of a conservative-style central planning. American conservatives may not adore the welfare state or excessive business regulation, but they appreciate power exercised in the name of nationalism, warfarism, pro-family policies, and invasions of personal liberty and privacy. In the post-LBJ period of American history, it has been Republican presidents more than Democratic ones who have been responsible for the largest expansions of executive and judicial power. It was to defend a pure liberty against the compromises and corruptions of conservatism, beginning with Nixon but continuing with Reagan and the Bush presidencies, that inspired the birth of Rothbardian political economy. It is also striking how Rothbard chose to pull no punches in his argument. Other intellectuals on the receiving end of such an invitation might have tended to water down the argument to make it more palatable. Why, for example, make a case for statelessness or anarchism when a case for limited government might bring more people into the movement? Why condemn U.S. imperialism when doing so can only limit the book's appeal to anti-Soviet conservatives who might otherwise appreciate the free market bent? Why go into such depth about privatizing courts and roads and water when doing so might risk alienating people? Why enter into the sticky area of regulation of consumption and of personal morality, and do it with such disorienting consistency when it would surely have drawn a larger audience to leave it out? And why go into such detail about monetary affairs and central banking and the like, when a watered-down case for free enterprise would have pleased so many Chamber of Commerce conservatives? But trimming and compromising for the sake of the times or the audience was just not his way. He knew that he had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to present the full package of libertarianism in all its glory, and he was not about to pass it up. And thus do we read here, not a case for cutting government, but eliminating it altogether. Not just an argument for assigning property rights, but for deferring to the market even on questions of contract enforcement, and not just a case for cutting welfare, but for banishing the entire welfare-warfare state. Whereas other attempts to make a libertarian case both before and after this book might typically call for transitional or half measures, or be willing to concede as much as possible to statists, that is not what we get from Murray. Not for him such schemes as school vouchers or the privatization of government programs that should not exist at all. Instead, he presents and follows through with the full-blown and fully bracing vision of what liberty can be. This is why so many other similar attempts to write the Libertarian Manifesto have not stood the test of time, and yet this book remains in high demand. Similarly, there have been many books on libertarianism in the intervening years that have covered philosophy alone, politics alone, economics alone, or history alone. Those that have put all these subjects together have usually been collections by various authors. Rothbard alone had mastery in all fields that permitted him to write an integrated manifesto, one that has never been displaced. And yet his approach is typically self-effacing. He constantly points to other writers and intellectuals of the past and his own generation. In addition, some introductions of this sort are written to give the reader an easier passage into a difficult book, but that is not the case here. He never talks down to his readers, but always with clarity. Rothbard speaks for himself. I'll spare the reader an enumeration of my favorite parts, or speculations of what passages Rothbard might have clarified if he had the chance to put out a new edition. The reader will discover on his or her own that every page exudes energy and passion, that the logic of his argument is impossibly compelling, and that the intellectual fire that inspired this work burns as bright now as it did all those years ago. The book is still regarded as dangerous, precisely because once the exposure to Rothbardianism takes place, no other book on politics, economics, or sociology can be read the same way again. What was once a commercial phenomenon has truly become a classical statement that I predict will be read for generations to come.
Preface. When the original edition of this book was published, 1973, the new libertarian movement in America was in its infancy. In half a dozen years, the movement has matured with amazing rapidity and has expanded greatly both in quantity and quality. Hence, while the discussion of libertarianism in this book has been strengthened and updated throughout, the greatest change is in our treatment of the libertarian movement. The original Chapter 1 on the new libertarian movement is now irrelevant and outdated, and it has been transformed into an appendix providing an annotated outline of the complex structure of the current movement. The new Chapter 1 on the libertarian heritage provides a brief but badly needed historical background of the American and Western tradition of liberty, and of its successes and failures, setting the stage for our discussion of its rebirth in today's movement. A new Chapter 9 has been added on the vital topic of inflation and the business cycle, and the roles of government and of the free market in creating or alleviating these evils. Finally, to the concluding chapter on strategy has been added a presentation and explanation of my recently gained conviction that liberty will win, that liberty will be making great strides immediately as well as in the long run, that, in short, liberty is an idea whose time has come. I owe the origin and inspiration of this book to my first editor, Tom Mandel, who had the vision to anticipate the recent enormous growth of interest in libertarianism. The book would neither have been conceived nor written without him. For the revised edition, Roy A. Childs, Jr., editor of Libertarian Review, was extremely helpful in suggesting needed changes. I would also like to thank Dominic T. Armentano of the Economics Department of the University of Hartford, Williamson M. Evers, editor of Inquiry, and Leonard P. Liggio, editor of the Literature of Liberty, for their welcome suggestions. Walter C. Mickelberg's unbounded enthusiasm for this book was vitally important in preparing the revised edition, and Edward H. Crane III, president of Cato Institute, San Francisco, was indispensable in providing help, encouragement, sound advice, and suggestions for improvement. Murray N. Rothbard, Palo Alto, California, February 1978. Chapter 1. The Libertarian Heritage. The American Revolution and Classical Liberalism. On Election Day, 1976, the Libertarian Party presidential ticket of Roger L. MacBride for president and David P. Berglund for vice president amassed 174,000 votes in 32 states throughout the country. The sober Congressional Quarterly was moved to classify the fledgling Libertarian Party as the third major political party in America. The remarkable growth rate of this new party may be seen in the fact that it only began in 1971 with a handful of members gathered in a Colorado living room. The following year, it fielded a presidential ticket, which managed to get on the ballot in 2 states, and now it is America's third major party. Even more remarkably, the Libertarian Party achieved this growth while consistently adhering to a new ideological creed, libertarianism, thus bringing to the American political scene for the first time in a century a party interested in principle rather than in merely gaining jobs and money at the public trough. We have been told countless times by pundits and political scientists that the genius of America and of our party system is its lack of ideology and its pragmatism, a kind word for focusing solely on grabbing money and jobs from the hapless taxpayers. How then explain the amazing growth of a new party which is frankly and eagerly devoted to ideology? One explanation is that Americans were not always pragmatic and non-ideological. On the contrary, historians now realize that the American Revolution itself was not only ideological, but also the result of devotion to the creed and institutions of libertarianism. The American revolutionaries were steeped in the creed of libertarianism, an ideology which led them to resist with their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor the invasions of their rights and liberties committed by the imperial British government. Historians have long debated the precise causes of the American Revolution. Were they constitutional, economic, political, or ideological? We now realize that, being libertarians, the revolutionaries saw no conflict between moral and political rights on the one hand and economic freedom on the other. On the contrary, they perceived civil and moral liberty, political independence, and the freedom to trade and produce as all part of one unblemished system, what Adam Smith was to call, in the same year that the Declaration of Independence was written, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. The libertarian creed emerged from the classical liberal movements of the 17th and 18th century in the Western world, specifically from the English Revolution of the 17th century. This radical libertarian movement, even though only partially successful in its birthplace, Great Britain, was still able to usher in the Industrial Revolution there by freeing industry and production from the strangling restrictions of state control and urban government-supported guilds. For the classical liberal movement was, throughout the Western world, a mighty libertarian revolution against what we might call the old order, the ancien régime, which had dominated its subjects for centuries. This regime had, in the early modern period, beginning in the 16th century, imposed an absolute central state and a king ruling by divine right, on top of an older, restrictive web of feudal land monopolies and urban guild controls and restrictions. The result was a Europe stagnating under a crippling web of controls, taxes, and monopoly privileges to produce and sell, conferred by central and local governments upon their favorite producers. This alliance of the new bureaucratic war-making central state with privileged merchants, an alliance to be called mercantilism by later historians, and with a class of ruling feudal landlords, constituted the old order against which the new movement of classical liberals and radicals arose and rebelled in the 17th and 18th centuries. The object of the classical liberals was to bring about individual liberty in all of its interrelated aspects. In the economy, taxes were to be drastically reduced, controls and regulations eliminated, and human energy, enterprise, and markets set free to create and produce in exchanges that would benefit everyone and the mass of consumers. Entrepreneurs were to be free at last to compete, to develop, to create. The shackles of control were to be lifted from land, labor, and capital alike. Personal freedom and civil liberty were to be guaranteed against the depredations and tyranny of the king or his minions. Religion, the source of bloody wars for centuries when sects were battling for control of the state, was to be set free from state imposition or interference, so that all religions, or non-religions, could coexist in peace. Peace, too, was the foreign policy credo of the new classical liberals. The age-old regime of imperial and state aggrandizement for power and pelf was to be replaced by a foreign policy of peace and free trade with all nations. And since war was seen as engendered by standing armies and navies, by military power always seeking expansion, these military establishments were to be replaced by voluntary local militia, by citizen civilians who would only wish to fight in defense of their own particular homes and neighborhoods. Thus, the well-known theme of separation of church and state was but one of many interrelated motifs that could be summed up as separation of the economy from the state, separation of speech and press from the state, separation of land from the state, separation of war and military affairs from the state, indeed, the separation of the state from virtually everything. The state, in short, was to be kept extremely small, with a very low, nearly negligible budget. The classical liberals never developed a theory of taxation, but every increase in a tax and every new kind of tax was fought bitterly, in America twice becoming the spark that led, or almost led, to the Revolution: the stamp tax, the tea tax. The earliest theoreticians of libertarian classical liberalism were the levelers during the English Revolution, and the philosopher John Locke in the late 17th century, followed by the true Whig, or radical libertarian opposition to the Whig settlement, the regime of 18th century Britain. John Locke set forth the natural rights of each individual to his person and property. The purpose of government was strictly limited to defending such rights. In the words of the Lockean-inspired Declaration of Independence, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. While Locke was widely read in the American colonies, his abstract philosophy was scarcely calculated to rouse men to revolution. This task was accomplished by radical Lockeans in the 18th century, who wrote in a more popular, hard-hitting, and impassioned manner, and applied the basic philosophy to the concrete problems of the government, and especially the British government, of the day. The most important writing in this vein was Cato's Letters, a series of newspaper articles published in the early 1720s in London by true Whigs John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. While Locke had written of the revolutionary pressure which could properly be exerted when government became destructive of liberty, Trenchard and Gordon pointed out that government always tended toward such destruction of individual rights. According to Cato's letters, human history is a record of irrepressible conflict between power and liberty, with power, government, always standing ready to increase its scope by invading people's rights and encroaching upon their liberties. Therefore, Cato declared, power must be kept small and faced with eternal vigilance and hostility on the part of the public to make sure that it always stays within its narrow bounds. We know by infinite examples and experience that men possessed of power, rather than part with it, will do anything, even the worst and the blackest, to keep it. And scarce ever any man upon earth went out of it as long as he could carry everything his own way in it. This seems certain, that the good of the world, or of their people, was not one of their motives, either for continuing in power or for quitting it. It is the nature of power to be ever encroaching and converting every extraordinary power granted at particular times and upon particular occasions into an ordinary power, to be used at all times, and when there is no occasion. Nor does it ever part willingly with any advantage. Alas, power encroaches daily upon liberty, with a success too evident, and the balance between them is almost lost. Tyranny has engrossed almost the whole earth, and striking at mankind root and branch makes the world a slaughterhouse, and will certainly go on to destroy till it is either destroyed itself, or, which is most likely, has left nothing else to destroy. Such warnings were eagerly imbibed by the American colonists, who reprinted Cato's letters many times throughout the colonies and down to the time of the Revolution. Such a deep-seated attitude led to what the historian Bernard Bailyn has aptly called the transforming radical libertarianism of the American Revolution. For the Revolution was not only the first successful modern attempt to throw off the yoke of Western imperialism, at that time of the world's mightiest power. More important, for the first time in history, Americans hedged in their new governments with numerous limits and restrictions embodied in constitutions and particularly in bills of rights. Church and state were rigorously separated throughout the new states, and religious freedom enshrined. Remnants of feudalism were eliminated throughout the states by the abolition of the feudal privileges of entail and primogeniture. In the former, a dead ancestor is able to entail landed estates in his family forever, preventing his heirs from selling any part of the land. In the latter, the government requires sole inheritance of property by the oldest son. The new federal government formed by the Articles of Confederation was not permitted to levy any taxes upon the public, and any fundamental extension of its powers required unanimous consent by every state government. Above all, the military and war-making power of the national government was hedged in by restraint and suspicion, for the 18th century libertarians understood that war, standing armies, and militarism had long been the main method for aggrandizing state power. Bernard Bailyn has summed up the achievement of the American revolutionaries. The modernization of American politics and government during and after the Revolution took the form of a sudden radical realization of the program that had first been fully set forth by the opposition intelligentsia in the reign of George I. Where the English opposition, forcing its way against a complacent social and political order, had only striven and dreamed, Americans, driven by the same aspirations, but living in a society in many ways modern and now released politically, could suddenly act. Where the English opposition had vainly agitated for partial reforms, American leaders moved swiftly and with little social disruption to implement systematically the outermost possibilities in the whole range of radically libertarian ideas. In the process, they infused into American political culture the major themes of 18th century radical libertarianism brought to realization here. The first is the belief that power is evil, a necessity perhaps, but an evil necessity, that it is infinitely corrupting, and that it must be controlled, limited, restricted in every way compatible with a minimum of civil order. Written constitutions, the separation of powers, bills of rights, limitations on executives, on legislatures and courts, restrictions on the right to coerce and wage war, all express the profound distrust of power that lies at the ideological heart of the American Revolution, and that has remained with us as a permanent legacy ever after. Thus, while classical liberal thought began in England, it was to reach its most consistent and radical development, and its greatest living embodiment, in America. For the American colonies were free of the feudal land monopoly and aristocratic ruling caste that was entrenched in Europe. In America, the rulers were British colonial officials and a handful of privileged merchants, who were relatively easy to sweep aside when the Revolution came, and the British government was overthrown. Classical liberalism, therefore, had more popular support and met far less entrenched institutional resistance in the American colonies than it found at home. Furthermore, being geographically isolated, the American rebels did not have to worry about the invading armies of neighboring counter-revolutionary governments, as, for example, was the case in France. After the Revolution. Thus, America, above all countries, was born in an explicitly libertarian revolution, a revolution against empire, against taxation, trade monopoly and regulation, and against militarism and executive power. The revolution resulted in governments unprecedented in restrictions placed on their power. But while there was very little institutional resistance in America to the onrush of liberalism, there did appear from the very beginning powerful elite forces, especially among the large merchants and planters, who wished to retain the restrictive British mercantilist system of high taxes, controls, and monopoly privileges conferred by the government. These groups wished for a strong central and even imperial government. In short, they wanted the British system without Great Britain. These conservative and reactionary forces first appeared during the Revolution and later formed the Federalist Party and the Federalist administration in the 1790s. During the 19th century, however, the libertarian impetus continued. The Jeffersonian and Jacksonian movements, the Democratic Republican and then the Democratic parties, explicitly strived for the virtual elimination of government from American life. It was to be a government without a standing army or navy, a government without debt and with no direct federal or excise taxes, and virtually no import tariffs, that is, with negligible levels of taxation and expenditure. A government that does not engage in public works or internal improvements, a government that does not control or regulate, a government that leaves money and banking free, hard, and uninflated. In short, in the words of H.L. Mencken's ideal, a government that barely escapes being no government at all. The Jeffersonian drive toward virtually no government foundered after Jefferson took office, first with concessions to the Federalists, possibly the result of a deal for Federalist votes to break a tie in the Electoral College, and then with the unconstitutional purchase of the Louisiana Territory. But most particularly it foundered with the imperialist drive toward war with Britain in Jefferson's second term, a drive which led to war and to a one-party system which established virtually the entire statist Federalist program: high military expenditures, a central bank, a protective tariff, direct federal taxes, public works. Horrified at the results, a retired Jefferson brooded at Monticello and inspired young visiting politicians Martin Van Buren and Thomas Hart Benton to found a new party, the Democratic Party, to take back America from the new federalism and to recapture the spirit of the old Jeffersonian program. When the two young leaders latched on to Andrew Jackson as their savior, the new Democratic Party was born. The Jacksonian libertarians had a plan. It was to be 8 years of Andrew Jackson as president, to be followed by 8 years of Van Buren, then 8 years of Benton. After 24 years of a triumphant Jacksonian democracy, the Menckian virtually no government ideal was to have been achieved. It was by no means an impossible dream, since it was clear that the Democratic Party had quickly become the normal majority party in the country. The mass of the people were enlisted in the libertarian cause. Jackson had his 8 years, which destroyed the central bank and retired the public debt, and Van Buren had 4, which separated the federal government from the banking system. But the 1840 election was an anomaly, as Van Buren was defeated by an unprecedentedly demagogic campaign engineered by the first great modern campaign chairman, Thurlow Weed, who pioneered in all the campaign frills, catchy slogans, buttons, songs, parades, etc., with which we are now familiar. Weed's tactics put in office the egregious and unknown Whig, General William Henry Harrison, but this was clearly a fluke. In 1844, the Democrats would be prepared to counter with the same campaign tactics, and they were clearly slated to recapture the presidency that year. Van Buren, of course, was supposed to resume the triumphal Jacksonian march. But then a fateful event occurred. The Democratic Party was sundered on the critical issue of slavery, or rather, the expansion of slavery into a new territory. Van Buren's easy renomination foundered on a split within the ranks of the Democracy over the admission to the Union of the Republic of Texas as a slave state. Van Buren was opposed, Jackson in favor, and this split symbolized the wider sectional rift within the Democratic Party. Slavery, the grave anti-libertarian flaw in the libertarianism of the Democratic program, had arisen to wreck the party and its libertarianism completely. The Civil War, in addition to its unprecedented bloodshed and devastation, was used by the triumphal and virtually one-party Republican regime to drive through its statist, formerly Whig program. National government power, protective tariff, subsidies to big business, inflationary paper money, resumed control of the federal government over banking, large-scale internal improvements, high excise taxes, and, during the war, conscription and an income tax. Furthermore, the states came to lose their previous right of secession and other states' powers as opposed to federal government powers. The Democratic Party resumed its libertarian ways after the war, but it now had to face a far longer and more difficult road to arrive at liberty than it had before. We have seen how America came to have the deepest libertarian tradition, a tradition that still remains in much of our political rhetoric, and is still reflected in a feisty and individualistic attitude toward government by much of the American people. There is far more fertile soil in this country than in any other for a resurgence of libertarianism. Resistance to liberty. We can now see that the rapid growth of the libertarian movement and the Libertarian Party in the 1970s is firmly rooted in what Bernard Bailyn called this powerful permanent legacy of the American Revolution. But if this legacy is so vital to the American tradition, what went wrong? Why the need now for a new libertarian movement to arise to reclaim the American dream? To begin to answer this question, we must first remember that classical liberalism constituted a profound threat to the political and economic interests, the ruling classes who benefited from the old order, the kings, the nobles and landed aristocrats, the privileged merchants, the military machines, the state bureaucracies. Despite three major violent revolutions precipitated by the liberals, the English of the 17th century and the American and French of the 18th, victories in Europe were only partial. Resistance was stiff and managed to successfully maintain landed monopolies, religious establishments, and warlike foreign and military policies, and for a time to keep the suffrage restricted to the wealthy elite. The liberals had to concentrate on widening the suffrage, because it was clear to both sides that the objective economic and political interests of the mass of the public lay in individual liberty. It is interesting to note that by the early 19th century, the laissez-faire forces were known as liberals and radicals, for the purer and more consistent among them, and the opposition that wished to preserve or go back to the old order were broadly known as conservatives. Indeed, conservatism began in the early 19th century as a conscious attempt to undo and destroy the hated work of the new classical liberal spirit, of the American, French, and industrial revolutions. Led by two reactionary French thinkers, de Bonald and de Maistre, conservatism yearned to replace equal rights and equality before the law by the structured and hierarchical rule of privileged elites, individual liberty and minimal government by absolute rule and big government, religious freedom by the theocratic rule of a state church, peace and free trade by militarism, mercantilist restrictions and war for the advantage of the nation-state, and industry and manufacturing by the old feudal and agrarian order. And they wanted to replace the new world of mass consumption and rising standards of living for all by the old order of bare subsistence for the masses and luxury consumption for the ruling elite. By the middle of, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, conservatives began to realize that their cause was inevitably doomed if they persisted in clinging to the call for outright repeal of the Industrial Revolution and of its enormous rise in the living standards of the mass of the public, and also if they persisted in opposing the widening of the suffrage, thereby frankly setting themselves in opposition to the interests of that public. Hence, the right wing, a label based on an accident of geography by which the spokesman for the old order sat on the right of the Assembly Hall during the French Revolution, decided to shift their gears and to update their statist creed by jettisoning outright opposition to industrialism and democratic suffrage. For the old conservatism's frank hatred and contempt for the mass of the public, the new conservatives substituted duplicity and demagogy. The new conservatives wooed the masses with the following line: "We too favor industrialism and a higher standard of living. But to accomplish such ends, we must regulate industry for the public good. We must substitute organized cooperation for the dog-eat-dog of the free and competitive marketplace. And above all, we must substitute for the nation-destroying liberal tenets of peace and free trade the nation-glorifying measures of war, protectionism, empire, and military prowess." For all of these changes, of course, big government rather than minimal government was required. And so in the late 19th century, statism and big government returned, but this time displaying a pro-industrial and pro-general welfare face. The old order returned, but this time the beneficiaries were shuffled a bit. They were not so much the nobility, the feudal landlords, the army, the bureaucracy, and privileged merchants, as they were the army, the bureaucracy, the weakened feudal landlords, and especially the privileged manufacturers. Led by Bismarck and Prussia, the new right fashioned a right-wing collectivism based on war, militarism, protectionism, and the compulsory cartelization of business and industry, a giant network of controls, regulations, subsidies, and privileges which forged a great partnership of big government with certain favored elements in big business and industry. Something had to be done, too, about the new phenomenon of a massive number of industrial wage workers, the proletariat. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, indeed until the late 19th century, the mass of workers favored laissez-faire and the free competitive market as best for their wages and working conditions as workers and for a cheap and widening range of consumer goods as consumers. Even the early trade unions, for example in Great Britain, were staunch believers in laissez-faire. New conservatives, spearheaded by Bismarck in Germany and Disraeli in Britain, weakened the libertarian will of the workers by shedding crocodile tears about the condition of the industrial labor force and cartelizing and regulating industry, not accidentally hobbling efficient competition. Finally, in the early 20th century, the new conservative corporate state, then and now the dominant political system in the Western world, incorporated responsible and corporatist trade unions as junior partners to big government and favored big businesses in the new statist and corporatist decision-making system. To establish this new system, to create a new order which was a modernized, dressed-up version of the Ancien Regime before the American and French revolutions, the new ruling elites had to perform a gigantic con job on the deluded public, a con job that continues to this day. Whereas the existence of every government, from absolute monarchy to military dictatorship, rests on the consent of the majority of the public, a democratic government must engineer such consent on a more immediate, day-by-day basis. And to do so, the new conservative ruling elites had to gull the public in many crucial and fundamental ways. For the masses now had to be convinced that tyranny was better than liberty, that a cartelized and privileged industrial feudalism was better for the consumers than a freely competitive market, that a cartelized monopoly was to be imposed in the name of anti-monopoly, and that war and military aggrandizement for the benefit of the ruling elites was really in the interests of the conscripted, taxed, and often slaughtered public. How was this to be done? In all societies, public opinion is determined by the intellectual classes, the opinion molders of society. For most people neither originate nor disseminate ideas and concepts. On the contrary, they tend to adopt those ideas promulgated by the professional intellectual classes, the professional dealers in ideas. Now, throughout history, as we shall see further below, despots and ruling elites of states have had far more need of the services of intellectuals than have peaceful citizens in a free society. For states have always needed opinion-molding intellectuals to con the public into believing that its rule is wise, good, and inevitable, into believing that the emperor has clothes. Until the modern world, such intellectuals were inevitably churchmen, or witch doctors, the guardians of religion. It was a cozy alliance, this age-old partnership between church and state. The church informed its deluded charges that the king ruled by divine command, and therefore must be obeyed. In return, the king funneled numerous tax revenues into the coffers of the church. Hence the great importance for the libertarian classical liberals of their success at separating church and state. The new liberal world was a world in which intellectuals could be secular, could make a living on their own, in the market, apart from state subvention. To establish their new statist order, their neo-mercantilist corporate state, the new conservatives therefore had to forge a new alliance between intellectual and state. In an increasingly secular age, this meant with secular intellectuals rather than with divines, specifically with the new breed of professors, PhDs, historians, teachers, and technocratic economists, social workers, sociologists, physicians, and engineers. This reforged alliance came in two parts. In the early 19th century, the conservatives, conceding reason to their liberal enemies, relied heavily on the alleged virtues of irrationality, romanticism, tradition, theocracy. By stressing the virtue of tradition and of irrational symbols, the conservatives could gull the public into continuing privileged hierarchical rule, and to continue to worship the nation-state and its war-making machine. In the latter part of the 19th century, the new conservatism adopted the trappings of reason and of science. Now it was science that allegedly required rule of the economy and of society by technocratic experts. In exchange for spreading this message to the public, the new breed of intellectuals was rewarded with jobs and prestige as apologists for the new order, and as planners and regulators of the newly cartelized economy and society. To ensure the dominance of the new statism over public opinion, to ensure that the public's consent would be engineered, the governments of the Western world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries moved to seize control over education, over the minds of men, over the universities, and over general education through compulsory school attendance laws and a network of public schools. The public schools were consciously used to inculcate obedience to the state, as well as other civic virtues among their young charges. Furthermore, this statizing of education ensured that one of the biggest vested interests in expanding statism would be the nation's teachers and professional educationists. One of the ways that the new statist intellectuals did their work was to change the meaning of old labels, and therefore to manipulate in the minds of the public the emotional connotations attached to such labels. For example, the laissez-faire libertarians had long been known as liberals, and the purest and most militant of them as radicals. They had also been known as progressives, because they were the ones in tune with industrial progress, the spread of liberty, and the rise in living standards of consumers. The new breed of statist academics and intellectuals appropriated to themselves the words liberal and progressive, and successfully managed to tar their laissez-faire opponents with the charge of being old-fashioned, Neanderthal, and reactionary. Even the name conservative was pinned on the classical liberals. And, as we have seen, the new statists were able to appropriate the concept of reason as well. If the laissez-faire liberals were confused by the new recrudescence of statism and mercantilism as progressive corporate statism, another reason for the decay of classical liberalism by the end of the 19th century was the growth of a peculiar new movement, socialism. Socialism began in the 1830s and expanded greatly after the 1880s. The peculiar thing about socialism was that it was a confused hybrid movement, influenced by both the two great pre-existing polar ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. From the classical liberals, the socialists took a frank acceptance of industrialism and the Industrial Revolution, an early glorification of science and reason, and at least a rhetorical devotion to such classical liberal ideals as peace, individual freedom, and a rising standard of living. Indeed, the socialists, long before the much later corporatists, pioneered in a co-opting of science, reason, and industrialism. And the socialists not only adopted the classical liberal adherence to democracy, but topped it by calling for an expanded democracy, in which the people would run the economy and each other. On the other hand, from the conservatives, the socialists took a devotion to coercion and the statist means for trying to achieve these liberal goals. Industrial harmony and growth were to be achieved by aggrandizing the state into an all-powerful institution, ruling the economy and the society in the name of science. A vanguard of technocrats was to assume all-powerful rule over everyone's person and property in the name of the people and of democracy. Not content with the liberal achievement of reason and freedom for scientific research, the socialist state would install rule by the scientists of everyone else. Not content with liberals setting the workers free to achieve undreamt-of prosperity, the socialist state would install rule by the workers of everyone else, or rather, rule by politicians, bureaucrats, and technocrats in their name. Not content with the liberal creed of equality of rights, of equality before the law, the socialist state would trample on such equality on behalf of the monstrous and impossible goal of equality or uniformity of results, or rather would erect a new privileged elite, a new class, in the name of bringing about such an impossible equality. Socialism was a confused and hybrid movement because it tried to achieve the liberal goals of freedom, peace, and industrial harmony and growth, goals which can only be achieved through liberty and the separation of government from virtually everything, by imposing the old conservative means of statism, collectivism, and hierarchical privilege. It was a movement which could only fail, which indeed did fail miserably in those numerous countries where it attained power in the 20th century, by bringing to the masses only unprecedented despotism, starvation, and grinding impoverishment. But the worst thing about the rise of the socialist movement was that it was able to outflank the classical liberals on the left, that is, as the party of hope, of radicalism, of revolution in the Western world. For just as the defenders of the ancien regime took their place on the right side of the hall during the French Revolution, so the liberals and radicals sat on the left. From then on until the rise of socialism, the libertarian classical liberals were the left, even the extreme left on the ideological spectrum. As late as 1848, such militant laissez-faire French liberals as Frédéric Bastiat sat on the left in the National Assembly. The classical liberals had begun as the radical revolutionary party in the West, as the party of hope and of change on behalf of liberty, peace, and progress. To allow themselves to be outflanked, to allow the socialists to pose as the party of the left, was a bad strategic error, allowing the liberals to be put falsely into a confused middle-of-the-road position with socialism and conservatism as the polar opposites. Since libertarianism is nothing if not a party of change and of progress toward liberty, abandonment of that role meant the abandonment of much of their reason for existence, either in reality or in the minds of the public. But none of this could have happened if the classical liberals had not allowed themselves to decay from within. They could have pointed out, as some of them indeed did, that socialism was a confused, self-contradictory, quasi-conservative movement, absolute monarchy and feudalism with a modern face, and that they themselves were still the only true radicals, undaunted people who insisted on nothing less than complete victory for the libertarian ideal. Decay from within. But after achieving impressive partial victories against statism, the classical liberals began to lose their radicalism, their dogged insistence on carrying the battle against conservative statism to the point of final victory. Instead of using partial victories as a stepping stone for ever more pressure, the classical liberals began to lose their fervor for change and for purity of principle. They began to rest content with trying to safeguard their existing victories, and thus turned themselves from a radical into a conservative movement. Conservative in the sense of being content to preserve the status quo. In short, the liberals left the field wide open for socialism to become the party of hope and of radicalism, and even for the later corporatists to pose as liberals and progressives, as against the extreme right-wing and conservative libertarian classical liberals, since the latter allowed themselves to be boxed into a position of hoping for nothing more than stasis, than absence of change. Such a strategy is foolish and untenable in a changing world. But the degeneration of liberalism was not merely one of stance and strategy, but one of principle as well. For the liberals became content to leave the war-making power in the hands of the state, to leave the education power in its hands, to leave the power over money and banking and over roads in the hands of the state. In short, to concede to state dominion over all the crucial levers of power in society. In contrast to the 18th century liberals' total hostility to the executive and to bureaucracy, the 19th century liberals tolerated and even welcomed the build-up of executive power and of an entrenched oligarchic civil service bureaucracy. Moreover, principle and strategy merged in the decay of 18th century and early 19th century liberal devotion to abolitionism, to the view that, whether the institution be slavery or any other aspect of statism, it should be abolished as quickly as possible, since the immediate abolition of statism, while unlikely in practice, was to be sought after as the only possible moral position. For to prefer a gradual whittling away to immediate abolition of an evil and coercive institution is to ratify and sanction such evil, and therefore to violate libertarian principles. As the great abolitionist of slavery and libertarian William Lloyd Garrison explained, urge immediate abolition as earnestly as we may, it will, alas, be gradual abolition in the end. We have never said that slavery would be overthrown by a single blow. That it ought to be, we shall always contend. There were two critically important changes in the philosophy and ideology of classical liberalism, which both exemplified and contributed to its decay as a vital, progressive, and radical force in the Western world. The first and most important, occurring in the early to mid-19th century, was the abandonment of the philosophy of natural rights and its replacement by technocratic utilitarianism. Instead of liberty grounded on the imperative morality of each individual's right to person and property, that is, instead of liberty being sought primarily on the basis of right and justice, utilitarianism preferred liberty as generally the best way to achieve a vaguely defined general welfare or common good. There were two grave consequences of this shift from natural rights to utilitarianism. First, the purity of the goal, the consistency of the principle, was inevitably shattered. For whereas the natural rights libertarian seeking morality and justice cleaves militantly to pure principle, the utilitarian only values liberty as an ad hoc expedient. And since expediency can and does shift with the wind, it will become easy for the utilitarian in his cool calculus of cost and benefit to plump for statism in ad hoc case after case, and thus to give principle away. Indeed, this is precisely what happened to the Benthamite utilitarians in England. Beginning with ad hoc libertarianism and laissez-faire, they found it ever easier to slide further and further into statism. An example was the drive for an efficient and therefore strong civil service and executive power, an efficiency that took precedence, indeed replaced, any concept of justice or right. Second, and equally important, it is rare indeed ever to find a utilitarian who is also radical, who burns for immediate abolition of evil and coercion. Utilitarians, with their devotion to expediency, almost inevitably oppose any sort of upsetting or radical change. There have been no utilitarian revolutionaries. Hence, utilitarians are never immediate abolitionists. The abolitionist is such because he wishes to eliminate wrong and injustice as rapidly as possible. In choosing this goal, there is no room for cool ad hoc weighing of cost and benefit. Hence, the classical liberal utilitarians abandoned radicalism and became mere gradualist reformers. But in becoming reformers, they also put themselves inevitably into the position of advisors and efficiency experts to the state. In other words, they inevitably came to abandon libertarian principle, as well as a principled libertarian strategy. The utilitarians wound up as apologists for the existing order, for the status quo, and hence were all too open to the charge by socialists and progressive corporatists that they were mere narrow-minded and conservative opponents of any and all change. Thus, starting as radicals and revolutionaries, as the polar opposites of conservatives, the classical liberals wound up as the image of the thing they had fought. This utilitarian crippling of libertarianism is still with us. Thus, in the early days of economic thought, utilitarianism captured free market economics with the influence of Bentham and Ricardo, and this influence is today fully as strong as ever. Current free market economics is all too rife with appeals to gradualism, with scorn for ethics, justice, and consistent principle, and with a willingness to abandon free market principles at the drop of a cost-benefit hat. Hence, current free market economics is generally envisioned by intellectuals as merely apologetics for a slightly modified status quo, and all too often such charges are correct. A second reinforcing change in the ideology of classical liberals came during the late 19th century, when, at least for a few decades, they adopted the doctrines of social evolutionism, often called social Darwinism. Generally, statist historians have smeared such social Darwinist laissez-faire liberals as Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner as cruel champions of the extermination, or at least of the disappearance, of the socially unfit. Much of this was simply the dressing up of sound economic and sociological free market doctrine in the then fashionable trappings of evolutionism. But the really important and crippling aspect of their social Darwinism was the illegitimate carrying over to the social sphere of the view that species, or later genes, change very, very slowly after millennia of time. The social Darwinist liberal came then to abandon the very idea of revolution or radical change, in favor of sitting back and waiting for the inevitable tiny evolutionary changes over eons of time. In short, ignoring the fact that liberalism had had to break through the power of ruling elites by a series of radical changes and revolutions, the social Darwinists became conservatives, preaching against any radical measures and in favor of only the most minutely gradual of changes. Ironically enough, modern evolutionary theory is coming to abandon completely the theory of gradual evolutionary change. Instead, it is now perceived that a far more accurate picture is sharp and sudden flips from one static species equilibrium to another. This is being called the theory of punctuational change. As one of the expounders of the new view, Professor Stephen Jay Gould writes, "Gradualism is a philosophy of change, not an induction from nature. Gradualism, too, has strong ideological components, more responsible for its previous success than any objective matching with external nature. The utility of gradualism as an ideology must explain much of its influence, for it became liberalism's quintessential dogma against radical change. Sudden flips are against the laws of nature." In fact, the great libertarian Spencer himself is a fascinating illustration of just such a change in classical liberalism, and his case is paralleled in America by William Graham Sumner. In a sense, Herbert Spencer embodies within himself much of the decline of liberalism in the 19th century. For Spencer began as a magnificently radical liberal, as virtually a pure libertarian. But as the virus of sociology and social Darwinism took over in his soul, Spencer abandoned libertarianism as a dynamic, radical historical movement, although without abandoning it in pure theory. While looking forward to an eventual victory of pure liberty, of contract as against status, of industry as against militarism, Spencer began to see that victory as inevitable, but only after millennia of gradual evolution. Hence, Spencer abandoned liberalism as a fighting radical creed and confined his liberalism in practice to a weary, conservative rearguard action against the growing collectivism and statism of his day. But if utilitarianism, bolstered by social Darwinism, was the main agent of philosophical and ideological decay in the liberal movement, the single most important and even cataclysmic reason for its demise was its abandonment of formerly stringent principles against war, empire, and militarism. In country after country, it was the siren song of nation-state and empire that destroyed classical liberalism. In England, the liberals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries abandoned the anti-war, anti-imperialist Little Englandism of Cobden, Bright, and the Manchester School. Instead, they adopted the obscenely entitled liberal imperialism, joining the conservatives in the expansion of empire, and the conservatives and the right-wing socialists in the destructive imperialism and collectivism of World War I. In Germany, Bismarck was able to split the previously almost triumphant liberals by setting up the lure of unification of Germany by blood and iron. In both countries, the result was the destruction of the liberal cause. In the United States, the classical liberal party had long been the Democratic Party, known in the latter 19th century as the party of personal liberty. Basically, it had been the party not only of personal, but also of economic liberty, the stalwart opponent of prohibition, of Sunday blue laws, and of compulsory education, the devoted champion of free trade, hard money, absence of governmental inflation, separation of banking from the state, and the absolute minimum of government. It construed state power to be negligible and federal power to be virtually non-existent. On foreign policy, the Democratic Party, though less rigorously, tended to be the party of peace, anti-militarism, and anti-imperialism. But personal and economic libertarianism were both abandoned with the capture of the Democratic Party by the Bryan forces in 1896, and the foreign policy of non-intervention was then rudely abandoned by Woodrow Wilson 2 decades later. It was an intervention and a war that were to usher in a century of death and devastation, of wars and new despotisms, and also a century in all warring countries of the new corporatist statism, of a welfare-warfare state run by an alliance of big government, big business, unions, and intellectuals that we have mentioned above. The last gasp, indeed, of the old laissez-faire liberalism in America was the doughty and aging libertarians who banded together to form the Anti-Imperialist League at the turn of the century, to combat the American war against Spain and the subsequent imperialist American war to crush the Filipinos, who were striving for national independence from both Spain and the United States. To current eyes, the idea of an anti-imperialist who is not a Marxist may seem strange, but opposition to imperialism began with laissez-faire liberals such as Cobden and Bright in England and Eugen Richter in Prussia. In fact, the Anti-Imperialist League, headed by Boston industrialist and economist Edward Atkinson, and including Sumner, consisted largely of laissez-faire radicals who had fought the good fight for the abolition of slavery and had then championed free trade, hard money, and minimal government. To them, their final battle against the new American imperialism was simply part and parcel of their lifelong battle against coercion, statism, and injustice, against big government in every area of life, both domestic and foreign. We have traced the rather grisly story of the decline and fall of classical liberalism after its rise and partial triumph in previous centuries. What, then, is the reason for the resurgence, the flowering, of libertarian thought and activity in the last few years, particularly in the United States? How could these formidable forces and coalitions for statism have yielded even that much to a resurrected libertarian movement? Shouldn't the resumed march of statism in the late 19th and 20th centuries be a cause for gloom, rather than usher in a reawakening of a seemingly moribund libertarianism? Why didn't libertarianism remain dead and buried? We have seen why libertarianism would naturally arise first and most fully in the United States, a land steeped in libertarian tradition. But we have not yet examined the question, why the renaissance of libertarianism at all within the last few years? What contemporary conditions have led to this surprising development? We must postpone answering this question until the end of the book, until we first examine what the libertarian creed is and how that creed can be applied to solve the leading problem areas in our society. Part 1. The Libertarian Creed. Chapter 2. Property and Exchange. The non-aggression axiom. The libertarian creed rests upon one central axiom, that no man or group of men may aggress against the person or property of anyone else. This may be called the non-aggression axiom. Aggression is defined as the initiation of the use or threat of physical violence against the person or property of anyone else. Aggression is therefore synonymous with invasion. If no man may aggress against another, if, in short, everyone has the absolute right to be free from aggression, then this at once implies that the libertarian stands foursquare for what are generally known as civil liberties, the freedom to speak, publish, assemble, and to engage in such victimless crimes as pornography, sexual deviation, and prostitution, which the libertarian does not regard as crimes at all, since he defines a crime as violent invasion of someone else's person or property. Furthermore, he regards conscription as slavery on a massive scale, and since war, especially modern war, entails the mass slaughter of civilians, the libertarian regards such conflicts as mass murder, and therefore totally illegitimate. All of these positions are now considered leftist on the contemporary ideological scale. On the other hand, since the libertarian also opposes invasion of the rights of private property, this also means that he just as emphatically opposes government interference with property rights, or with the free market economy through controls, regulations, subsidies, or prohibitions. For if every individual has the right to his own property without having to suffer aggressive depredation, then he also has the right to give away his property, bequest and inheritance, and to exchange it for the property of others, free contract and the free market economy, without interference. The libertarian favors the right to unrestricted private property and free exchange, hence a system of laissez-faire capitalism. In current terminology, again, the libertarian position on property and economics would be called extreme right-wing. But the libertarian sees no inconsistency in being leftist on some issues and rightist on others. On the contrary, he sees his own position as virtually the only consistent one, consistent on behalf of the liberty of every individual. For how can the leftist be opposed to the violence of war and conscription, while at the same time supporting the violence of taxation and government control? And how can the rightist trumpet his devotion to private property and free enterprise, while at the same time favoring war, conscription, and the outlawing of non-invasive activities and practices that he deems immoral? And how can the rightist favor a free market while seeing nothing amiss in the vast subsidies, distortions, and unproductive inefficiencies involved in the military-industrial complex? While opposing any and all private or group aggression against the rights of person and property, the libertarian sees that throughout history and into the present day, there has been one central, dominant, and overriding aggressor upon all of these rights: the state. In contrast to all other thinkers, left, right, or in between, the libertarian refuses to give the state the moral sanction to commit actions that almost everyone agrees would be immoral, illegal, and criminal if committed by any person or group in society. The libertarian, in short, insists on applying the general moral law to everyone, and makes no special exemptions for any person or group. But if we look at the state naked, as it were, we see that it is universally allowed, and even encouraged, to commit all the acts which even non-libertarians concede are reprehensible crimes. The state habitually commits mass murder, which it calls war, or sometimes suppression of subversion. The state engages in enslavement into its military forces, which it calls conscription. And it lives and has its being in the practice of forcible theft, which it calls taxation. The libertarian insists that whether or not such practices are supported by the majority of the population is not germane to their nature, that regardless of popular sanction, war is mass murder, conscription is slavery, and taxation is robbery. The libertarian, in short, is almost completely the child in the fable, pointing out insistently that the emperor has no clothes. Throughout the ages, the emperor has had a series of pseudo-clothes provided for him by the nation's intellectual caste. In past centuries, the intellectuals informed the public that the state or its rulers were divine, or at least clothed in divine authority, and therefore what might look to the naive and untutored eye as despotism, mass murder, and theft on a grand scale was only the divine working its benign and mysterious ways in the body politic. In recent decades, as the divine sanction has worn a bit threadbare, the emperor's court intellectuals have spun ever more sophisticated apologia, informing the public that what the government does is for the common good and the public welfare, that the process of taxation and spending works through the mysterious process of the multiplier to keep the economy on an even keel, and that, in any case, a wide variety of governmental services could not possibly be performed by citizens acting voluntarily on the market or in society. All of this the libertarian denies. He sees the various apologia as fraudulent means of obtaining public support for the state's rule, and he insists that whatever services the government actually performs could be supplied far more efficiently and far more morally by private and cooperative enterprise. The libertarian therefore considers one of his prime educational tasks is to spread the demystification and desanctification of the state among its hapless subjects. His task is to demonstrate repeatedly and in depth that not only the emperor, but even the democratic state has no clothes, that all governments subsist by exploitive rule over the public, and that such rule is the reverse of objective necessity. He strives to show that the very existence of taxation and the state necessarily sets up a class division between the exploiting rulers and the exploited ruled. He seeks to show that the task of the court intellectuals, who have always supported the state, has ever been to weave mystification in order to induce the public to accept state rule, and that these intellectuals obtain, in return, a share in the power and pelf extracted by the rulers from their deluded subjects. Take, for example, the institution of taxation, which statists have claimed is in some sense really voluntary. Anyone who truly believes in the voluntary nature of taxation is invited to refuse to pay taxes and to see what then happens to him. If we analyze taxation, we find that among all the persons and institutions in society, only the government acquires its revenues through coercive violence. Everyone else in society acquires income either through voluntary gift, lodge, charitable society, chess club, or through the sale of goods or services voluntarily purchased by consumers. If anyone but the government proceeded to tax, this would clearly be considered coercion and thinly disguised banditry. Yet the mystical trappings of sovereignty have so veiled the process that only libertarians are prepared to call taxation what it is: legalized and organized theft on a grand scale. Property rights. If the central axiom of the libertarian creed is non-aggression against anyone's person and property, how is this axiom arrived at? What is its groundwork or support? Here, libertarians, past and present, have differed considerably. Roughly, there are three broad types of foundation for the libertarian axiom, corresponding to three kinds of ethical philosophy: the emotivist, the utilitarian, and the natural rights viewpoint. The emotivists assert that they take liberty or non-aggression as their premise purely on subjective emotional grounds. While their own intense emotion might seem a valid basis for their own political philosophy, this can scarcely serve to convince anyone else. By ultimately taking themselves outside the realm of rational discourse, the emotivists thereby ensure the lack of general success of their own cherished doctrine. The utilitarians declare from their study of the consequences of liberty as opposed to alternative systems that liberty will lead more surely to widely approved goals: harmony, peace, prosperity, etc. Now, no one disputes that relative consequences should be studied in assessing the merits or demerits of respective creeds. But there are many problems in confining ourselves to a utilitarian ethic. For one thing, utilitarianism assumes that we can weigh alternatives and decide upon policies on the basis of their good or bad consequences. But if it is legitimate to apply value judgments to the consequences of X, why is it not equally legitimate to apply such judgments to X itself? May there not be something about an act itself which, in its very nature, can be considered good or evil? Another problem with the utilitarian is that he will rarely adopt a principle as an absolute and consistent yardstick to apply to the varied concrete situations of the real world. He will only use a principle, at best, as a vague guideline or aspiration, as a tendency which he may choose to override at any time. This was the major defect of the 19th century English radicals, who had adopted the laissez-faire view of the 18th century liberals, but had substituted a supposedly scientific utilitarianism for the supposedly mystical concept of natural rights as the groundwork for that philosophy. Hence the 19th century laissez-faire liberals came to use laissez-faire as a vague tendency rather than as an unblemished yardstick, and therefore increasingly and fatally compromised the libertarian creed. To say that a utilitarian cannot be trusted to maintain libertarian principle in every specific application may sound harsh, but it puts the case fairly. A notable contemporary example is the free market economist Professor Milton Friedman, who, like his classical economist forebears, holds to freedom as against state intervention as a general tendency, but in practice allows a myriad of damaging exceptions which serve to vitiate the principle almost completely, notably in the fields of police and military affairs, education, taxation, welfare, neighborhood effects, antitrust laws, and money and banking. Let us consider a stark example. Suppose a society which fervently considers all redheads to be agents of the devil, and therefore to be executed whenever found. Let us further assume that only a small number of redheads exist in any generation, so few as to be statistically insignificant. The utilitarian libertarian might well reason, while the murder of isolated redheads is deplorable, the executions are small in number. The vast majority of the public, as non-redheads, achieves enormous psychic satisfaction from the public execution of redheads. The social cost is negligible. The social psychic benefit to the rest of society is great. Therefore, it is right and proper for society to execute the redheads. The natural rights libertarian, overwhelmingly concerned as he is for the justice of the act, will react in horror and staunchly and unequivocally oppose the executions as totally unjustified murder and aggression upon non-aggressive persons. The consequence of stopping the murders, depriving the bulk of society of great psychic pleasure, would not influence such a libertarian, the absolutist libertarian, in the slightest. Dedicated to justice and to logical consistency, the natural rights libertarian cheerfully admits to being doctrinaire, to being, in short, an unabashed follower of his own doctrines. Let us turn then to the natural rights basis for the libertarian creed, a basis which, in one form or another, has been adopted by most of the libertarians past and present. Natural rights is the cornerstone of a political philosophy which, in turn, is embedded in a greater structure of natural law. Natural law theory rests on the insight that we live in a world of more than one, in fact, a vast number of entities, and that each entity has distinct and specific properties, a distinct nature which can be investigated by man's reason, by his sense perception and mental faculties. Copper has a distinct nature and behaves in a certain way, and so do iron, salt, etc. The species man, therefore, has a specifiable nature, as does the world around him, and the ways of interaction between them. To put it with undue brevity, the activity of each inorganic and organic entity is determined by its own nature, and by the nature of the other entities with which it comes in contact. Specifically, while the behavior of plants, and at least the lower animals, is determined by their biological nature, or perhaps by their instincts, the nature of man is such that each individual person must, in order to act, choose his own ends, and employ his own means in order to attain them. Possessing no automatic instincts, each man must learn about himself and the world, use his mind to select values, learn about cause and effect, and act purposively to maintain himself and advance his life. Since men can think, feel, evaluate, and act only as individuals, it becomes vitally necessary for each man's survival and prosperity that he be free to learn, choose, develop his faculties, and act upon his knowledge and values. This is the necessary path of human nature. To interfere with and cripple this process by using violence goes profoundly against what is necessary by man's nature for his life and prosperity. Violent interference with a man's learning and choices is therefore profoundly anti-human. It violates the natural law of man's needs. Individualists have always been accused by their enemies of being atomistic, of postulating that each individual lives in a kind of vacuum, thinking and choosing without relation to anyone else in society. This, however, is an authoritarian straw man. Few, if any, individualists have ever been atomists. On the contrary, it is evident that individuals always learn from each other, cooperate and interact with each other, and that this, too, is required for man's survival. But the point is that each individual makes the final choice of which influences to adopt and which to reject, or of which to adopt first and which afterwards. The libertarian welcomes the process of voluntary exchange and cooperation between freely acting individuals. What he abhors is the use of violence to cripple such voluntary cooperation and force someone to choose and act in ways different from what his own mind dictates. The most viable method of elaborating the natural rights statement of the libertarian position is to divide it into parts, and to begin with the basic axiom of the right to self-ownership. The right to self-ownership asserts the absolute right of each man, by virtue of his or her being a human being, to own his or her own body. That is, to control that body, free of coercive interference. Since each individual must think, learn, value, and choose his or her ends and means in order to survive and flourish, the right to self-ownership gives man the right to perform these vital activities without being hampered and restricted by coercive molestation. Consider, too, the consequences of denying each man the right to own his own person. There are then only two alternatives. Either 1, a certain class of people, A, have the right to own another class, B, or 2, everyone has the right to own his own equal quotal share of everyone else. The first alternative implies that while Class A deserves the rights of being human, Class B is in reality subhuman, and therefore deserves no such rights. But since they are indeed human beings, the first alternative contradicts itself in denying natural human rights to one set of humans. Moreover, as we shall see, allowing Class A to own Class B means that the former is allowed to exploit, and therefore to live parasitically, at the expense of the latter. But this parasitism itself violates the basic economic requirement for life, production and exchange. The second alternative, what we might call participatory communalism, or communism, holds that every man should have the right to own his equal quotal share of everyone else. If there are 2 billion people in the world, then everyone has the right to own 1/2 billionth of every other person. In the first place, we can state that this ideal rests on an absurdity, proclaiming that every man is entitled to own a part of everyone else, yet is not entitled to own himself. Secondly, we can picture the viability of such a world, a world in which no man is free to take any action whatever without prior approval or indeed command by everyone else in society. It should be clear that in that sort of communist world, no one would be able to do anything, and the human race would quickly perish. But if a world of zero self-ownership and 100% other ownership spells death for the human race, then any steps in that direction also contravene the natural law of what is best for man and his life on Earth. Finally, however, the participatory communist world cannot be put into practice, for it is physically impossible for everyone to keep continual tabs on everyone else, and thereby to exercise his equal quotal share of partial ownership over every other man. In practice, then, the concept of universal and equal other ownership is utopian and impossible, and supervision, and therefore control and ownership of others, necessarily devolves upon a specialized group of people, who thereby become a ruling class. Hence, in practice, any attempt at communist rule will automatically become class rule, and we would be back at our first alternative. The libertarian therefore rejects these alternatives, and concludes by adopting as his primary axiom the universal right of self-ownership, a right held by everyone by virtue of being a human being. A more difficult task is to settle on a theory of property in non-human objects, in the things of this earth. It is comparatively easy to recognize the practice when someone is aggressing against the property right of another's person. If A assaults B, he is violating the property right of B in his own body. But with non-human objects, the problem is more complex. If, for example, we see X seizing a watch in the possession of Y, we cannot automatically assume that X is aggressing against Y's right of property in the watch. For may not X have been the original true owner of the watch, who can therefore be said to be repossessing his own legitimate property? In order to decide, we need a theory of justice in property, a theory that will tell us whether X or Y, or indeed someone else, is the legitimate owner. Some libertarians attempt to resolve the problem by asserting that whoever the existing government decrees has the property title should be considered the just owner of the property. At this point, we have not yet delved deeply into the nature of government, but the anomaly here should be glaring enough. It is surely odd to find a group eternally suspicious of virtually any and all functions of government, suddenly leaving it to government to define and apply the precious concept of property, the base and groundwork of the entire social order. It is particularly the utilitarian laissez-faireists who believe it most feasible to begin the new libertarian world by confirming all existing property titles, that is, property titles and rights as decreed by the very government that is condemned as a chronic aggressor. Let us illustrate with a hypothetical example. Suppose that libertarian agitation and pressure has escalated to such a point that the government and its various branches are ready to abdicate, but they engineer a cunning ruse. Just before the government of New York State abdicates, it passes a law turning over the entire territorial area of New York to become the private property of the Rockefeller family. The Massachusetts legislature does the same for the Kennedy family, and so on for each state. The government could then abdicate and decree the abolition of taxes and coercive legislation, but the victorious libertarians would now be confronted with a dilemma. Do they recognize the new property titles as legitimately private property? The utilitarians, who have no theory of justice in property rights, would, if they were consistent with their acceptance of given property titles as decreed by government, have to accept a new social order in which 50 new satraps would be collecting taxes in the form of unilaterally imposed rent. The point is that only natural rights libertarians, only those libertarians who have a theory of justice in property titles that does not depend on government decree, could be in a position to scoff at the new ruler's claims to have private property in the territory of the country, and to rebuff these claims as invalid. As the great 19th century liberal Lord Acton saw clearly, the natural law provides the only sure ground for a continuing critique of governmental laws and decrees. What specifically the natural rights position on property titles may be, is the question to which we now turn. We have established each individual's right to self-ownership, to a property right in his own body and person. But people are not floating wraiths. They are not self-subsistent entities. They can only survive and flourish by grappling with the earth around them. They must, for example, stand on land areas. They must also, in order to survive and maintain themselves, transform the resources given by nature into consumer goods, into objects more suitable for their use and consumption. Food must be grown and eaten. Minerals must be mined and then transformed into capital and then useful consumer goods, etc. Man, in other words, must own not only his own person, but also material objects for his control and use. How then should the property titles in these objects be allocated? Let us take as our first example a sculptor fashioning a work of art out of clay and other materials, and let us waive for the moment the question of original property rights in the clay and the sculptor's tools. The question then becomes, who owns the work of art as it emerges from the sculptor's fashioning? It is, in fact, the sculptor's creation, not in the sense that he has created matter, but in the sense that he has transformed nature-given matter, the clay, into another form dictated by his own ideas and fashioned by his own hands and energy. Surely it is a rare person who, with the case put thus, would say that the sculptor does not have the property right in his own product. Surely, if every man has the right to own his own body, and if he must grapple with the material objects of the world in order to survive, then the sculptor has the right to own the product he has made, by his energy and effort, a veritable extension of his own personality. He has placed the stamp of his person upon the raw material by mixing his labor with the clay, in the phrase of the great property theorist John Locke, and the product transformed by his own energy has become the material embodiment of the sculptor's ideas and vision. John Locke put the case this way: every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever, then, he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it, and joined it to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to. As in the case of the ownership of people's bodies, we again have three logical alternatives. 1. Either the transformer or creator has the property right in his creation, or 2. Another man or set of men have the right in that creation, that is, have the right to appropriate it by force without the sculptor's consent, or 3. Every individual in the world has an equal quotal share in the ownership of the sculpture, the communal solution. Again, put baldly, there are very few who would not concede the monstrous injustice of confiscating the sculptor's property, either by one or more others, or on behalf of the world as a whole. By what right do they do so? By what right do they appropriate to themselves the product of the Creator's mind and energy? In this clear-cut case, the right of the Creator to own what he has mixed his person and labor with would be generally conceded. Once again, as in the case of communal ownership of persons, the world communal solution would in practice be reduced to an oligarchy of a few others expropriating the Creator's work in the name of world public ownership. The main point, however, is that the case of the sculptor is not qualitatively different from all cases of production. The man or men who had extracted the clay from the ground and had sold it to the sculptor may not be as creative as the sculptor, but they too are producers. They too have mixed their ideas and their technological know-how with the nature-given soil to emerge with a useful product. They too are producers, and they too have mixed their labor with natural materials to transform those materials into more useful goods and services. These persons too are entitled to the ownership of their products. Where then does the process begin? Again, let us turn to Locke. He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. I ask then, when did they begin to be his? When he digested, or when he ate, or when he boiled, or when he brought them home, or when he picked them up? And 'tis plain, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could. That labor put a distinction between them and common. That added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done, and so they became his private right. And will anyone say he had no right to those acorns or apples he thus appropriated, because he had not the consent of all mankind to make them his? Was it a robbery thus to assume to himself what belonged to all in common? If such a consent as that was necessary, man had starved, notwithstanding the plenty God had given him. Thus the grass my horse has bit, the turfs my servant has cut, and the ore I have digged in my place, where I have a right to them in common with others, become my property without the assignation or consent of anybody. The labor that was mine, removing them out of that common state they were in, hath fixed my property in them. By making an explicit consent of every commoner necessary to any one's appropriating to himself any part of what is given in common, children or servants could not cut the meat which their father or master had provided for them in common without assigning to every one his peculiar part. Though the water running in the fountain be everyone's, yet who can doubt but that in the pitcher is his only who drew it out? His labor hath taken it out of the hands of nature where it was common, and hath thereby appropriated it to himself. Thus the law of reason makes the deer that Indian's who killed it. 'Tis allowed to be his goods who hath bestowed his labor upon it, though before it was the common right of everyone. And amongst those who are counted the civilized part of mankind, this original law of nature for the beginning of property in what was before common still takes place, and by virtue thereof, what fish any one catches in the ocean, that great and still remaining common of mankind, or what ambergris any one takes up here is by the labor that removes it out of that common state nature left it in, made his property, who takes that pains about it. If every man owns his own person, and therefore his own labor, and if by extension he owns whatever property he has created or gathered out of the previously unused, unowned state of nature, then what of the last great question, the right to own or control the earth itself? In short, if the gatherer has the right to own the acorns or berries he picks, or the farmer the right to own his crop of wheat or peaches, who has the right to own the land on which these things have grown? It is at this point that Henry George and his followers, who have gone all the way so far with the Libertarians, leave the track and deny the individual's right to own the piece of land itself, the ground on which these activities have taken place. The Georgists argue that, while every man should own the goods which he produces or creates, since nature or God created the land itself, no individual has the right to assume ownership of that land. Yet if the land is to be used at all as a resource in any sort of efficient manner, it must be owned or controlled by someone or some group. And we are again faced with our three alternatives. Either the land belongs to the first user, the man who first brings it into production, or it belongs to a group of others, or it belongs to the world as a whole, with every individual owning a quotal part of every acre of land. George's option for the last solution hardly solves his moral problem. If the land itself should belong to God or nature, then why is it more moral for every acre in the world to be owned by the world as a whole than to concede individual ownership? In practice, again, it is obviously impossible for every person in the world to exercise effective ownership of his 4 billionth portion, if the world population is, say, 4 billion, of every piece of the world's land surface. In practice, of course, a small oligarchy would do the controlling and owning, and not the world as a whole. But apart from these difficulties in the Georgist position, the natural rights justification for the ownership of ground land is the same as the justification for the original ownership of all other property. For as we have seen, no producer really creates matter. He takes nature-given matter and transforms it by his labor energy in accordance with his ideas and vision. But this is precisely what the pioneer, the homesteader, does when he brings previously unused land into his own private ownership. Just as the man who makes steel out of iron ore transforms that ore out of his know-how and with his energy, and just as the man who takes the iron out of the ground does the same, so does the homesteader who clears, fences, cultivates, or builds upon the land. The homesteader, too, has transformed the character of the nature-given soil by his labor and his personality. The homesteader is just as legitimately the owner of the property as the sculptor or the manufacturer. He is just as much a producer as the others. Furthermore, if the original land is nature or God-given, then so are people's talents, health, and beauty. And just as all these attributes are given to specific individuals and not to society, so then are land and natural resources. All of these resources are given to individuals and not to society, which is an abstraction that does not actually exist. There is no existing entity called society. There are only interacting individuals. To say that society should own land or any other property in common, then, must mean that a group of oligarchs, in practice government bureaucrats, should own the property, and at the expense of expropriating the creator or the homesteader who had originally brought this product into existence. Moreover, no one can produce anything without the cooperation of original land, if only as standing room. No man can produce or create anything by his labor alone. He must have the cooperation of land and other natural raw materials. Man comes into the world with just himself and the world around him, the land and natural resources given him by nature. He takes these resources and transforms them by his labor and mind and energy into goods more useful to man. Therefore, if an individual cannot own original land, neither can he, in the full sense, own any of the fruits of his labor. The farmer cannot own his wheat crop if he cannot own the land on which the wheat grows. Now that his labor has been inextricably mixed with the land, he cannot be deprived of one without being deprived of the other. Moreover, if a producer is not entitled to the fruits of his labor, who is? It is difficult to see why a newborn Pakistani baby should have a moral claim to a quotal share of ownership of a piece of Iowa land that someone has just transformed into a wheat field, and vice versa, of course, for an Iowan baby and a Pakistani farm. Land in its original state is unused and unowned. Georgists and other land communalists may claim that the whole world population really owns it, but if no one has yet used it, it is, in the real sense, owned and controlled by no one. The pioneer, the homesteader, the first user and transformer of this land, is the man who first brings this simple valueless thing into production and social use. It is difficult to see the morality of depriving him of ownership in favor of people who have never gotten within 1,000 miles of the land, and who may not even know of the existence of the property over which they are supposed to have a claim. The moral natural rights issue involved here is even clearer if we consider the case of animals. Animals are economic land, since they are original nature-given resources. Yet will anyone deny full title to a horse to the man who finds and domesticates it? Is this any different from the acorns and berries that are generally conceded to the gatherer? Yet in land, too, some homesteader takes the previously wild, undomesticated land and tames it by putting it to productive use. Mixing his labor with land sites should give him just as clear a title as in the case of animals. As Locke declared, as much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. He by his labor does, as it were, enclose it from the common. The libertarian theory of property was eloquently summed up by two 19th-century laissez-faire French economists. If man acquires rights over things, it is because he is at once active, intelligent, and free. By his activity, he spreads over external nature. By his intelligence, he governs it, and bends it to his use. By his liberty, he establishes between himself and it the relation of cause and effect, and makes it his own. Where is there in a civilized country a clod of earth, a leaf, which does not bear this impress of the personality of man? In the town, we are surrounded by the works of man. We walk upon a level pavement or a beaten road. It is man who made healthy the formerly muddy soil, who took from the side of a faraway hill the flint or stone which covers it. We live in houses. It is man who has dug the stone from the quarry, who has hewn it, who has planed the woods. It is the thought of man which has arranged the materials properly and made a building of what was before rock and wood. And in the country, the action of man is still everywhere present. Men have cultivated the soil, and generations of laborers have mellowed and enriched it. The works of man have dammed the rivers and created fertility where the waters had brought only desolation. Everywhere a powerful hand is divined, which has molded matter, and an intelligent will which has adapted it to the satisfaction of the wants of one same being. Nature has recognized her master, and man feels that he is at home in nature. Nature has been appropriated by him for his use. She has become his own. She is his property. This property is legitimate. It constitutes a right as sacred for man as is the free exercise of his faculties. It is his because it has come entirely from himself, and is in no way anything but an emanation from his being. Before him there was scarcely anything but matter. Since him, and by him, there is interchangeable wealth, that is to say, articles having acquired a value by some industry, by manufacture, by handling, by extraction, or simply by transportation. From the picture of a great master, which is perhaps of all material production that in which matter plays the smallest part, to the pail of water which the carrier draws from the river and takes to the consumer, wealth, whatever it may be, acquires its value only by communicated qualities, and these qualities are part of human activity, intelligence, strength. The producer has left a fragment of his own person in the thing, which has thus become valuable, and may hence be regarded as a prolongation of the faculties of man acting upon external nature. As a free being, he belongs to himself. Now the cause, that is to say, the productive force, is himself. The effect, that is to say, the wealth produced, is still himself. Who shall dare contest his title of ownership, so clearly marked by the seal of his personality? It is then to the human being, the creator of all wealth, that we must come back. It is by labor that man impresses his personality on matter. It is labor which cultivates the earth and makes of an unoccupied waste an appropriated field. It is labor which makes of an untrodden forest a regularly ordered wood. It is labor, or rather a series of labors, often executed by a very numerous succession of workmen, which brings hemp from seed, thread from hemp, cloth from thread, clothing from cloth, which transforms the shapeless pyrite, picked up in the mine, into an elegant bronze which adorns some public place, and repeats to an entire people the thought of an artist. Property, made manifest by labor, participates in the rights of the person whose emanation it is. Like him, it is inviolable so long as it does not extend so far as to come into collision with another right. Like him, it is individual, because it has origin in the independence of the individual, and because, when several persons have cooperated in its formation, the latest possessor has purchased with a value the fruit of his personal labor, the work of all the fellow laborers who have preceded him. This is what is usually the case with manufactured articles. When property has passed, by sale or by inheritance, from one hand to another, its conditions have not changed. It is still the fruit of human liberty manifested by labor, and the holder has the rights as the producer who took possession of it by right. Society and the individual. We have talked at length of individual rights, but what, it may be asked, of the rights of society? Don't they supersede the rights of the mere individual? The libertarian, however, is an individualist. He believes that one of the prime errors in social theory is to treat society as if it were an actually existing entity. Society is sometimes treated as a superior or quasi-divine figure with overriding rights of its own, at other times as an existing evil which can be blamed for all the ills of the world. The individualist holds that only individuals exist, think, feel, choose, and act, and that society is not a living entity, but simply a label for a set of interacting individuals. Treating society as a thing that chooses and acts, then, serves to obscure the real forces at work. If in a small community 10 people band together to rob and expropriate 3 others, then this is clearly and evidently a case of a group of individuals acting in concert against another group. In this situation, if the 10 people presume to refer to themselves as society, acting in its interest, the rationale would be laughed out of court. Even the 10 robbers would probably be too shamefaced to use this sort of argument. But let their size increase, and this kind of obfuscation becomes rife, and succeeds in duping the public. The fallacious use of a collective noun like nation, similar in this respect to society, has been trenchantly pointed out by the historian Parker T. Moon. When one uses the simple monosyllable France, one thinks of France as a unit, an entity. When we say, France sent her troops to conquer Tunis, we impute not only unit, but personality to the country. The very words conceal the facts, and make international relations a glamorous drama in which personalized nations are the actors, and all too easily we forget the flesh and blood men and women who are the true actors. If we had no such word as France, then we should more accurately describe the Tunis expedition in some such way as this. A few of these 38 million persons sent 30,000 others to conquer Tunis. This way of putting the fact immediately suggests a question, or rather, a series of questions. Who were the few? Why did they send the 30,000 to Tunis? And why did these obey? Empire building is done not by nations, but by men. The problem before us is to discover the men, the active, interested minorities in each nation who are directly interested in imperialism, and then to analyze the reasons why the majorities pay the expense and fight the war necessitated by imperialist expansion. The individualist view of society has been summed up in the phrase, "Society is everyone but yourself." Put thus bluntly, this analysis can be used to consider those cases where society is treated not only as a superhero with super rights, but as a supervillain on whose shoulders massive blame is placed. Consider the typical view that not the individual criminal, but society is responsible for his crime. Take, for example, the case where Smith robs or murders Jones. The old-fashioned view is that Smith is responsible for his act. The modern liberal counters that society is responsible. This sounds both sophisticated and humanitarian until we apply the individualist perspective. Then we see that what liberals are really saying is that everyone but Smith, including, of course, the victim Jones, is responsible for the crime. Put this baldly, almost everyone would recognize the absurdity of this position. But conjuring up the fictive entity society obfuscates this process. As the sociologist Arnold W. Green puts it, it would follow then that if society is responsible for crime, and criminals are not responsible for crime, only those members of society who do not commit crime can be held responsible for crime. Nonsense this obvious can be circumvented only by conjuring up society as devil, as evil being, apart from people and what they do. The great American libertarian writer Frank Chodorov stressed this view of society when he wrote that society are people. Society is a collective concept and nothing else. It is a convenience for designating a number of people. So too is family, or crowd, or gang, or any other name we give to an agglomeration of persons. Society is not an extra person. If the census totals 100 million, that's all there are, not one more, for there cannot be any accretion to society except by procreation. The concept of society as a metaphysical person falls flat when we observe that society disappears when the component parts disperse, as in the case of a ghost town or of a civilization we learn about by the artifacts they left behind. When the individuals disappear, so does the whole. The whole has no separate existence. Using the collective noun with a singular verb leads us into a trap of the imagination. We are prone to personalize the collectivity and to think of it as having a body and a psyche of its own. Free exchange and free contract. The central core of the libertarian creed, then, is to establish the absolute right to private property of every man. First, in his own body, and second, in the previously unused natural resources which he first transforms by his labor. These two axioms, the right of self-ownership and the right to homestead, establish the complete set of principles of the libertarian system. The entire libertarian doctrine then becomes the spinning out and the application of all the implications of this central doctrine. For example, a man, X, owns his own person and labor, and the farm he clears on which he grows wheat. Another man, Y, owns the fish he catches. A third man, Z, owns the cabbages he has grown and the land under it. But if a man owns anything, he then has the right to give away or exchange these property titles to someone else, after which point the other person also has absolute property title. From this corollary right to private property stems the basic justification for free contract and the free market economy. Thus, if X grows wheat, he may and probably will agree to exchange some of that wheat for some of the fish caught by Y, or for some of the cabbages grown by Z. With both X and Y making voluntary agreements to exchange property titles, or Y and Z, or X and Z, the property then becomes, with equal legitimacy, the property of the other person. If X exchanges wheat for Y's fish, then that fish becomes X's property to do with as he wishes, and the wheat becomes Y's property in precisely the same way. Further, a man may exchange not only the tangible objects he owns, but also his own labor, which of course he owns as well. Thus, Z may sell his labor services of teaching farmer X's children in return for some of the farmer's produce. It so happens that the free market economy and the specialization and division of labor it implies is by far the most productive form of economy known to man, and has been responsible for industrialization and for the modern economy on which civilization has been built. This is a fortunate utilitarian result of the free market, but it is not to the libertarian the prime reason for his support of this system. That prime reason is moral, and is rooted in the natural rights defense of private property we have developed above. Even if a society of despotism and systematic invasion of rights could be shown to be more productive than what Adam Smith called the system of natural liberty, the libertarian would support this system. Fortunately, as in so many other areas, the utilitarian and the moral, natural rights and general prosperity, go hand in hand. The developed market economy, as complex as the system appears to be on the surface, is nothing more than a vast network of voluntary and mutually agreed upon two-person exchanges, such as we have shown to occur between wheat and cabbage farmers, or between the farmer and the teacher. Thus, when I buy a newspaper for a dime, a mutually beneficial two-person exchange takes place. I transfer my ownership of the dime to the newsdealer, and he transfers ownership of the paper to me. We do this because, under the division of labor, I calculate that the paper is worth more to me than the dime, while the newsdealer prefers the dime to keeping the paper. Or, when I teach at a university, I estimate that I prefer my salary to not expending my labor of teaching, while the university authorities calculate that they prefer gaining my teaching services to not paying me the money. If the newsdealer insists